I am not a Japanese, I'm not a Dalit, but it is, I think it is my right to speak against discrimination, and I think it is not only my right but my duty to speak against discrimination. And it is a duty of everyone who is in favor of liberty to speak against discrimination, because the fight is not over. Well, I would like to get rid of an image saying that, especially in Western circles, we believe that caste discrimination exists in India because India is a poor country and the society in India is backward and so on. Well, caste discrimination existed in France and it has still here. Caste discrimination existed in Korea and it is longer in Korea. And yet, in Japan, which is a modern society, a rich country, there is still discrimination. So let us have a look at why this situation still exists. The term burakumin is, refers literally to people living in a small village, usually rural. Burakumin are Japanese minority social group. As some people said, the burakumin are Japan's invisible race. And someone said that they are invisible due to the fact that there are no physical characteristics that distinguish them from the other Japanese, contrary to main other groups, such as the Ainu in the north of Japan, in Hokkaido, or the people living in Okinawa, or the Korean in Japan, who are different from the rest of the Japanese. According to the League for Liberation of Buraku, there are about 6 million people belonging to this caste system in modern Japan. But officially, the governance data are different. There are only, nearly 1 million registered burakumin in Japan, according to the government. But people who belong to the burakumin do not want to be registered as such, and they support the League, but they do not. They want to be in the mainstream of Japanese. That is a big issue. Originally, these people were called semin, that is, despised citizens. The Japanese caste was formally abolished in 1871, and yet the system persisted. And the people who were, well, new commoners were called senmin. But these settlements, the place where they lived, were still remote places, well, they still live in those areas. Alors, what is the origin of this system? According to some authors, the caste system was established as early as the 8th century in the Christian era. The Japanese population was divided into two main groups according to Shinto concepts of purity. This is a concept of purity. Shintoism was basically a primitive folk religion, and Shinto concepts equated goodness and godliness with purity and cleanliness. Shinto concept of taboo or pollution held that impurities could cling to people, making them evil and or sinful. There were acceptable citizens or good citizens who were engaged in agriculture, and they belonged to the state, and they had to pay a duty of tax in labor or in kind. The other group was called privately owned people, or despised citizens, because they are of a non-agricultural and non-productive occupation. Some authors suggest that those people were seen as religious people possessing a special talent which enabled them to interact with the mystical world. Some were also involved in ritual duties. Because of these special powers, those despised people could have been a political threat to the Japanese emperor, who was a living god. And the emperor was the highest position, and the despised people were in the lowest. And this bipolar situation could account for this discrimination. This discriminatory structure of society was strengthened when Buddhism was penetrated in Japan. Taboos of meat eating, animal slaughter, and leather making became generalized and was extrapolated to concerns about the impurity of handling meat. As in India, it is the same situation. This injunction came to be associated with handling dead humans as well. Consequently, anyone who engaged in relative activities was, by definition, impure and to be avoided. Pollution could be caused by contact with the bodies of dead animals, and thus came to be associated with leather work. Gradually, the Shinto concept of taboo and pollution became linked to the Buddhist prohibition of taking any life. The first proclamation which outlawed the eating of flesh of certain animals occurred in 676 AD. During the Edo period, that is the feudal period in Japan between 1603 and 1868, discrimination was based with Buddhist religious concept and which was firmly implanted in the Japanese mentality. Below the emperor and the feudal lords, there were the famous samurai, and there were the farmers, and the merchants, and also the skilled artisans. All those people had acceptable occupations. Below them, the despised people practiced unacceptable or despised occupations, tainted with ritual impurity, involving special mystical power linked to magicians or shamans. They had their own temples and were not allowed to visit other religious sites. During this period, the despised people were divided into two new groups, Ita, which is literally full of filth. We saw in the film someone who deals with the dirt. This is exactly the same in Japan. And they were also given derogatory names, such as beast, ignoble. But they had, this was an inherited status, passed on to one's children. Marriage was permitted, but only with a fellow Eta. On the contrary, other people called non-human, hime, became a statute which was imposed on people who were punished. For instance, for petty theft, for running away from your village, participating in failed suicide, for instance, or running some illegal gambling games. As there were non-people, they couldn't marry. By the same logic, they could not have any children. So there were non-people outside of society. A Shinto reformer in the 18th century argued that the inherent purity of the Burakunim necessitated the separatedness. And in 1859, a magistrate in the court decided that an Ita is worth 1/7 of a normal person. When dealing with members of other castes, the despised people were expected to display signs of submission, like in India. Same. There were mainly animal slaughterers, butchers, leather makers, or disposers of corpses, executioners, undertakers, grave diggers. There were priests of various folk beliefs, medicine men, shamans, or even traveling actors, monkey handlers, beggars. There were also some sort of degrading occupations like aviculture, why not, or straw or bamboo ware handicraft, why not. And some ex-convicts were those who worked as town guards, but also as street cleaners, like in India, or public sanitation workers and so on. Some castes were also called people who lived in a dried up riverbed because they couldn't grow any rice in these places. Well, the Meiji Restoration and the Emancipation Act was supposed to put an end to this. In 1871, the Meiji government issued an emancipation edict. The exact name of the emancipation edict was Edict Abolishing Ignoble Classes. So it was in the name, it was also ignoble to belong to these classes. Some peasants protested against this edict in some 20 villages, and there were riots. They refused to be placed on the same rank as Buraku people and demanded the retractation of the edict. Rioting peasants entered Buraku villages and they killed and set fire to the village. However, the elimination of economic monopolies, which Burakunim had over a certain occupation, actually led to a decline of their general living standards, while social discrimination simply continued. For example, the ban on consumption of meat from livestock was lifted in 1871 in order to westernize the economy and the country, and many former eaters simply moved on to work in the abattoir. On the other hand, a significant portion of the leather industry was snatched away by non-Burakunim, and as a result, many Burakunim lost their jobs and had to work for very low wages in construction sites. They worked for very low wages, and many women could find no way to survive other than becoming prostitutes. In Imperial Japan, Simnin, that is despised citizen, were turned into a reserve army for labor with the new capitalist system. During that period, the first attempt to tackle with discrimination was initiated by Nakai Chomin, the Rousseau of the East. In 1890, Chomin was elected to the Diet, the lower house of parliament, for Osaka, a very famous place for Burakumin, on a platform demanding an end to the discrimination against the Burakumin. However, Chomin and his movement for liberty and the rights of people were submitted to political harassment by the government of Imperial Japan, and Chomin was forced to resign within a few months. With the exception of the very short period, such as under the Saijoni cabinet, Prince Saijoni was a radical in the French sense of the term. He was a friend of Clemenceau and he was a free thinker. During this very short period, Japan, except for this very short period, Japan became an imperialist power ruled by an oligarchy and of wealthy noblemen and a military caste, which led Japan to a series of colonial wars in Korea, Manchuria, and China. Korea was submitted to imperial law by Japan, and Japan nearly submitted all the Korean to slavery. They were brought to Japan by the thousands, and even during the last World War, women in Korea were submitted to what is called comfort women for the military, and they became prostitutes. Okay. Well, you know that Japan collapsed after the Second World War, ended by an atomic bomb. And this atomic bomb, two atomic bombs in fact, destroyed all Japan. And the bombing of Japan destroyed also the hamlets where the people lived. So there was a big destruction, and the society was changed. First of all, the emperor was no longer a living god. And he was the symbol of the state, but he deriving his position for the will of the people. It is very important to understand that. All the people were equal, were made equal, and yet under the law. and this is the Constitution, there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin. This is very important. And yet, the situation has not exactly changed. Well, there was a lot of improvement. We have to acknowledge this. Because in 1969, the government passed the special measure laws for assimilation project. And they spent nearly 12 trillion of yen over 33 years. It was the price for to end, or to try to end discrimination in Japan. And as for marriage, for instance, lots of improvement was made. And now about 60 to 80% of Burakumin marry a non-Burakumin woman. Now, the situation has changed. But it has to be, the price was millions and trillions of yen to end discrimination. And discrimination is not finished, it's not over, because people who want to pass as mainstream Japanese, and when they are sorted out as former Burakunin, well, they are submitted to insults and discrimination. So the fight is not over. We have to fight again, despite all the millions who were spent for this, against this discrimination. Thank you very much.